The smell reaches you before anything else does. Not a single smell, but a layered one, the kind that sits in the back of your throat and doesn't leave. You're a wool merchant's apprentice in a city on the Mediterranean coast, late summer, 1347. You've heard rumors from the eastern ports. Everyone has. Sailors coming off Genoese trading ships with blackened fingers and swollen lumps the size of a fist under their arms. The harbor masters let them dock anyway. Commerce is commerce, and the cargoes were good. Within a week, the men who unloaded those ships were dying in the streets. Within 2 weeks, so were their families. You live 3 streets back from the harbor. 3 streets, which, as it turns out, is not a number with any real medical significance. Your body is not ready for what is coming. This is worth stating plainly because you might think otherwise. You eat, you sleep, you work hard enough that your hands are calloused and your back is permanently curved from the angle of the counting table. You're not frail. You're 24 years old and you've survived a famine and 2 brutal winters and a fever that took your younger brother when you were 12. You think of yourself as someone who endures. The plague does not care about your personal history of endurance. What is moving through the harbor district right now is Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried in the gut of a flea riding on the back of a black rat, and it has been traveling west through trade routes for 2 years without slowing down for anything. The first symptom is the swelling. It appears in your lymph nodes, the ones in your groin or your armpit or your neck, and it starts as a tenderness you might mistake for bruising. Then it becomes a lump. Then the lump becomes an egg-sized mass so painful that men have been found in the streets unable to walk because the swelling in their groin had locked their legs apart. These are the buboes. This is bubonic plague, and it's actually the version with the highest survival rate, which tells you something about the other versions. If the bacteria enters your bloodstream directly, there's septicemic plague. Blackened skin, internal hemorrhaging, death sometimes within hours of the first symptom. If it reaches your lungs, pneumonic plague, airborne now, spread through breath alone. You don't need a flea for that one. You just need to stand near the wrong person. You don't know any of this. Neither does your physician, because germ theory won't exist for another 5 centuries. What your physician knows is the theory of miasma, the idea that disease travels through bad air, through the invisible rot of corrupted atmosphere rising from swamps, from unburied bodies, from the wrong alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. He wears a long waxed coat and a beaked mask stuffed with dried herbs when he walks the streets. The herbs are lavender and camphor and rosemary. They do nothing. The coat does nothing. The mask does nothing. He charges an enormous fee for the consultation, which is perhaps the most medieval detail in this entire story. And then he tells you to bleed yourself and burn aromatic wood near your bed. You follow his instructions. Of course you do. He's the physician. The city's response is its own kind of chaos. The flagellants arrive first, groups of men moving through the streets in procession, flogging their own backs with knotted leather straps, chanting, bleeding into the cobblestones. They believe the plague is God's punishment for human sin, and that sufficient suffering will satisfy the debt. They move from city to city, which is an extraordinarily efficient way to spread a disease you don't understand. The Jews are blamed in several cities before the month is out, not for any reason that holds together under examination. But fear doesn't require coherence, only a target. Pogroms erupt in Strasbourg, in Mainz, in Worms. The Pope issues a papal bull stating explicitly that Jews are not responsible for the plague. Nobody listens. Your neighborhood begins to empty. It happens faster than you'd expect, this particular quiet. Houses that were full of noise a week ago are silent now. You walk past a door standing open and see a man slumped inside, nobody around him. You don't go in, nobody goes in. The bodies begin to accumulate faster than the gravediggers can handle, which in a city where half the gravediggers are also sick, means they accumulate in the streets and in courtyards and in doorways. The church bells ring constantly, then they stop, because the bell ringers are dead too. That silence is somehow worse than the noise was. You develop the first swelling on a Tuesday. You notice it under your left arm, that initial tenderness, and you spend approximately 2 hours convincing yourself it's a pulled muscle from carrying crates at the merchant's yard. By evening, it's too large to be anything else. Your landlady opens your door. takes one look at you, and closes it again from the outside. You hear the bolt slide. She nails a red cross to the door. This is the official municipal response. Quarantine by isolation, which is actually the most medically sensible thing anyone in this city has done in 6 weeks. And it comes far too late for it to matter. Inside the room, you have what you had when you went to bed. A water jug, about half full. A heel of bread from yesterday morning. A wool blanket, a small wooden cross on the wall. The fever arrives in the night and takes your sense of time completely. Hours stop corresponding to anything observable. The bubo under your arm reaches a size that makes every breath a negotiation. You're sweating through the blanket and freezing simultaneously. No one comes. This is not cruelty exactly. Everyone outside is managing their own version of this same arithmetic. They have children, parents, their own survival to calculate. You lie on the floor because the floor is cooler than the mattress, and you pray in fragments, pieces of prayers you learned as a boy that you can no longer assemble into anything whole. Roughly a third of you survive. This is the honest statistical answer, a mortality rate somewhere between 30 and 60% depending on the region, the season, the variant, and factors nobody at the time could measure. If you're in the bubonic category and you're young and you were reasonably well nourished before exposure, your immune system has some chance of mounting a response. The bubo might rupture. The fever might break. Men have walked out of locked rooms after 10 days, thin and shaking, blinking at streets that no longer looked like the ones they remembered. They emerged into a city that had lost a third of its population in a matter of months and had no framework for understanding what had just happened to it. The survivors inherited a world rearranged at every level. So many landlords were dead that surviving tenants simply stopped paying rent and nobody came to collect. So many skilled craftsmen were gone that wages for laborers rose dramatically across Europe, because the same work that had once competed for the labor of 10 men now competed for the labor of 6. The feudal arrangements that had structured everything for centuries began to loosen. Serfs walked off estates. Peasants negotiated. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without violence in both directions. But the equilibrium had shifted and it wouldn't shift back. The plague returned in 1361. Again in 1369. Again in 1374. It kept returning for the next 3 centuries, smaller and larger, killing differently each time, finding populations that had grown back just enough to be worth devastating again. The psychological architecture of surviving cities is harder to reconstruct. Chronicles from the period describe something that reads less like grief and more like a complete suspension of ordinary moral accounting. Men who had been pious their whole lives abandoned churches, drinking and gambling, and behavior the clergy condemned as moral collapse, spread through survivor communities in the months after major outbreaks. It makes a certain sense. You'd built your life around a set of assumptions about how the world worked, what God wanted, what following the rules would protect you from. The plague had tested every single assumption and found them all structurally inadequate. What you do with that information depends on the person. But almost nobody came out of it without recalibrating something fundamental. The medicine catches up, slowly, the way medicine always does after enough people have died to make the patterns undeniable. Quarantine protocols in Venice get formalized into actual law by the 1370s. Ships arriving from infected ports are required to anchor offshore for 40 days before anyone disembarks. Quarantino. 40 days. The word comes from the Italian for 40, which is one of those small etymological leftovers that connects the present to a specific dead end in medical history. The rats are still everywhere. The fleas are still on the rats. The connection between the two and the disease won't be established scientifically until 1898, when a French physician named Paul Louis Simond demonstrates the transmission chain in Bombay during yet another outbreak. By then, Europe has been living with plague for 5.5 centuries on its own uncertain terms. Back in your locked room on the 5th day, the fever breaks. You don't know yet if this means survival or just a pause before the next wave of it. You're too weak to stand. The water jug is empty. The bread ran out on day 2. Outside, through the single-shuttered window, you can hear the plague cart moving through the street, the driver calling for the dead in a flat, carrying voice. The wheels grinding over cobblestones, slick with something you don't want to name. You lie still and listen to it pass. Then it passes. Then there's just the sound of your own breathing, which is louder than you remembered it being, and stranger, and something you have never before noticed was worth paying attention to.